Hey, everybody. Hope everybody's enjoying day 2 of the spring virtual conference. Just want to go ahead and throw out a huge thank you to Andrew Copeland and everybody at Craft Beer Professionals for putting this on. If there's one thing that the industry needs more of, it's more opportunities for us to be able to help each other and be able to really create opportunities for discussion and for learning. After all, this whole industry really started with us trying to do something unique, do something different, and really be able to wedge open some space for ourselves and for the other breweries around us, against the tide of modernity and commodity beer. So, with that in mind, one of the big things that we really need to tackle within the industry is just maturing a bit as an industry. Uh, this isn't 1995 anymore. This isn't 1979 anymore. This isn't even 2005 anymore. We're a fully fledged, mature industry, and a lot of stuff is happening within that. We have 9,000 breweries in the US. We're starting to see mergers and acquisitions really start to pick up. Grocery stores have started slimming down their selection. Things have gotten both more competitive and also a lot more adventurous and a lot more innovative. However, you may feel about throwing a whole hostess cupcakes into the mash tun. So, with all that in mind, we really need to be able to take an honest look and an honest assessment at the tools that we have available and how best to use them in order to really be able to run our business, not just as a hobby, but as, something productive, something we can really make a living at. After all, you can make great beer and be a home brewer. Start a craft brewery because you want to sell great beer. And with that comes a responsibility, and with that comes an opportunity to really put your focus on running your business as effectively as possible to accomplish whatever goals you may set for yourself. So with that in mind, one of the chief things I want to talk about today is going to be, assuming I can figure out how to share screens well, boom, data analysis. Now, I know this doesn't sound like the most exciting topic in the world, and I won't lie to you and tell you that it's going to be as exhilarating as, I don't know, bungee jumping off the side of a bridge. But, data doesn't not only have to not be boring, it can actually be incredibly useful to you and your business. And it doesn't have to be intimidating either. One of the biggest things we run into is this industry, we really like to run things by feel. Run things by anecdote, run things by things we see with our eyes empirically, rather than really being able to step back and take a look at what's actually going on and utilizing every little periscope into the market that we can. For a lot of folks, the reason for that is they just don't even really know how to get started on finding and taking a look at and acting against the data, and really being able to get a good sense of what it means, how to interpret it, and what to do from there. Now, I don't pretend to be some sort of master of data. I don't pretend to be coming in here with some, multiple degrees in that, or, as if this is the one and only thing that I do for my day job. I did marry a data analyst, but she's smarter than me in most regards, with the exception of being dumb enough to marry me. So I got a little bit of experience with that. And if there's one thing that I want to instill in everybody today, it's that diving into the data doesn't have to be intimidating. Diving into the data doesn't have to be something impossibly difficult that you don't think that you're equipped to do. It's something each and every one of us who run breweries, who manage breweries, who make decisions at breweries, not only can do, but should be doing on a daily basis to really guide our decision making. So with that in mind, why is data important? Well, anything in life that you're doing, you want to make sure that you're going into it with as much information as is realistically possible. You might have had a friend come up to you and tell you, if you put all of your money into, this one investment, then I absolutely promise you it's going to pay off. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. Now, you can go ahead and you listen to your friend. You can go ahead and do a basic Google search, or you can take the responsibility onto yourself to actually go ahead and dive in a little further, take a little more of a look into what's actually been going on into it, and educate yourself a bit before you take the leap of putting your savings and putting your life's work on the line there. It's the same thing for your business. If the only thing that you're making business decisions on is what's right in front of you and what you're seeing in your tap room, what you're seeing, right in front of you on a day-to-day basis, you're missing an enormous amount. Not just about what's happening within your own business, because that's incredibly valuable to understand the performance of your portfolio, understand the opportunities you have internally, understand the areas that you can take it, but also to understand the market around you and the context in which you're moving. So often when you've got your nose to the grindstone, you're running any sort of small business, it can really feel like you're on an island, can really feel like you're in this isolated situation. And the only person you're competing against is yourself. But that's just not true. With over 9,000 breweries across the US, even as we are still focused on co-opetition, we are still focused on creating a congenial environment, still focused on supporting each other. Not only are we creating a more difficult environment for us to be able to reach customers and be able to communicate our own unique story to customers, but we're also still competing with traditional bars and restaurants. And when it comes to people's dollars and people's forms of entertainment, we're still also competing with, movies and video games and, board games and pretty much any other thing people might be spending their money of in lieu of going out and having drinks with friends. So being able to understand the data gives us the context and gives us the actionable insights to be able to make some of those decisions a lot more readily. It also allows us to act proactively. When you have a good assessment of what is happening, a lot of times you're able to better figure out what is going to happen, or at least what is likely going to happen. That allows you to, instead of just putting fires out on a daily basis and reacting to whatever opportunities come across your plate, it allows you to start acting on the opportunities that you see before anyone else does, and to act on those opportunities before they've even really become known or really presented themselves. That allows you to be one step ahead of the game, and that allows you to really get in a position where you are moving towards your goals rather than responding to the goals that get put in front of you. It's also very good to be able to measure your own success. I think any of us, we have our own personal metrics of success, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to measure something to really be able to say whether or not you've attained what you're going for. Now, that's not necessarily to say that you need to be able to point to, scoreboard and point to revenue and say, I'm making more revenue than everybody else. That's my version of success. But even if your version of success is just being able to provide a third place for the people in your neighborhood, the people in your community, it's good to be able to keep track of things like private events and the number of people from the neighborhood who come in the door. What's the average spend that they have? How much are they engaging with your community events? Because that helps give you a real sense of the impact you're actually making and not just the impact that you feel like you're making, because that can definitely lead you down the wrong path. Just be careful with data, though. One big thing with data is objective and data is true. The big issue is that data is only as useful as the interpretations you draw from it. We'll talk a little bit about that as I dive into it, but at the end of the day, just make sure that just because you see a number there, numbers only tell a part of the story. It's bringing those numbers together alongside the context of what you're trying to measure that really helps inform it. Anybody who tells you all that you need is one key number is definitely somebody who's got something to sell. Well, where can you find data? Excuse me. Where can you find data? That's one of the chief things I hear from companies that I talk to. They don't even know where to start on being able to gather it. And there's plenty of outside sources, plenty of fantastic places that you can go to get some of that more raw data, some of the stuff that you can parse on your own. You do have places like IRI and Nielsen. They provide what's called scan data. That's data that's drawn largely from grocery stores, to a lesser degree on-prem and convenience stores, and really just gauges what people are physically buying as people are scanning products in. It helps paint more of a vivid picture into what they're actually taking home in their individual baskets. Very, very useful for getting a total picture of the market, but also very, very broad and, not necessarily useful when you're just trying to figure out what's going on for your 3-barrel brew house that mostly services your own neighborhood. There's also internal sources. If you have a CRM system, even if it's as simple as you just doing everything manually in, Excel spreadsheets and QuickBooks, that's data that you're building every time that you make a sale. That's data that you're building every time that you compile those reports, that you send out an invoice. That's stuff that you can go back and refer to and really be able to draw a trend line against your historicals. That's your opportunity to go in and, rather than feeling like something is your best beer and the one that's the most popular, actually be able to look not only into how popular it is, but how well it's selling, what kind of profit margins does it have, and does it tend to do well in different times of the year. That's stuff that you can use as information for planning in the future. Maybe you have a beer that absolutely crushes it in June, but absolutely gets slaughtered in December. maybe it's time to start making that a seasonal. Maybe your focus, your time, your energy, your tank space is better spent on something else. And if you're in distribution, VIP is another one that's absolutely vital and absolutely useful. VIP is used by most of the wholesalers throughout the US, especially the larger wholesalers. And it's a very, very comprehensive database of all of the products that you have passing through their systems, where they're being sold, in what velocities, at what volumes. And that's incredibly powerful, not only to be able to get a gauge of what your wholesalers are doing, but also for yourself to really be able to dive into that reporting and get a good sense of what's gaining traction where, so that you can begin asking the questions of why, how do you remediate the ones that aren't performing well, and how do you take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves with the ones that are. There's also some sources that aggregate some of that information. Some of those are more formal, some of them are less so. Armadillo is one that a lot of people are familiar with, acts as an information aggregate, kind of similar to VIP. The Brewers Association also puts out pretty regular reports, a lot of which are directly actionable and very, very useful even to small breweries. The NBWA, which is National Beer Wholesalers Alliance, another one that does some fantastic work. Lester Jones, their chief economist, is pretty active in being able to provide education, support, and information for craft breweries to help them be able to work with their wholesalers and get real results out of them. The Beer Institute. Beer Institute is basically what the BA is, plus Miller and Bud. Their big goal is mostly lobbying, but they will put out reports on the beer industry as a whole, but most of it is very high level. And then last but not least, Beer Marketers Insights. Beer Marketers Insights, if you want to pay for a subscription, they'll give you pretty much every piece of cutting edge, bleeding edge news that you can need around the industry. But they do have a free newsletter, their Express newsletter, which still has a ton of very, very actionable data and could really help keep you informed on what's happening around the industry and what's happening around the business without sending you too deep down the rabbit hole or without breaking your budget. Now, what's the problem with most of these sources of information? They're expensive, oftentimes prohibitively expensive. If you wanted full access to IRI or Nielsen, in some cases, that will run you $15,000 or above, depending on the level of access, the number of regions, and the depth you want. Obviously, for most small breweries, that's not exactly going to be a good deal. It's not exactly going to be something you're going to get that money back on. So a lot of what you want to focus on is your internal information sources and anything that you're able to glean from around the market from some of those cheaper or some of those free sources like Beer Marketers Insights newsletter. But I can't reiterate enough, those historicals are going to be your best friend and should always be the first place you go to really get a good sense of what's happening with your business. Now, when it comes to data, like we said before, it's not so much about the numbers themselves. Those are the start. That's important. But if you don't know how to analyze the data, if you don't know how to interpret the data, it's not going to mean much to you. I know what the Cyrillic alphabet is. I know that it's used in Russian. But I don't speak Russian, so no matter how much you put it on paper, I'm never going to be able to read it and get any sort of value or information out of it. The same goes for data. Now, there are a lot of analysts out there, some who provide analysis either free or for a subscription, some who require more of an actual business or relationship, a partner with, for them to be able to provide individualized insights. But there are definitely some great ones out there, ones I would highly recommend, and ones that aren't going to break the bank. In particular, Sightlines Plus. It's run by Brewbound, Brian Roth and Kate Bernot being two of the primary contributors there. Provides all sorts of absolutely wonderful deep dive data and articles about all aspects of the industry and beyond, even things that are adjacent to the industry. One of the things that's absolutely key to remember is that we're all beverage companies now. And we always were to a degree. Even if you don't make hard seltzer, you're competing against hard seltzer in the market. And not just that, but people have more non-alcoholic options than they've ever had in the past. And a lot of times the trends that affect the alcohol industry happen in non-alc. It's important to stay up to date on those and really keep a good set of eye lines on even those things you don't participate in that might be taking people away from your business. Spirits, for example, have been by far the fastest growing segment of beverage alcohol for the last few years. That means things like Cutwater Spirits, High Noon. Those are things that are going to be directly competing with the things you have on offer. And it behooves you to be able to really take a look at them and pay attention to any of the insights or any of the information about what's coming down the pipe. It's also important to keep an eye out that there's a whole lot of analysts out there, both professional and amateur, and they all have opinions on every topic. That includes me. Anybody who follows me on social media knows that I love the sound of my own voice and I love to provide unqualified opinions on quite literally everything. Don't take business advice from me. Don't take business advice from any analyst unless A, you know that they're trustworthy. B, you're well aware of the fact that they're going to have their own particular biases, their own particular hills they want to die on, and you take those into account and you make sure you check some of that. And C, it's always good to be able to check multiple sources of analysis just to really build some sort of consensus. One of the best things that the scientific method has ever come up with is the concept of peer review. It's the idea that it's all well and good to run an experiment, have that experiment prove something, but until you've had your peers within the scientific community have the opportunity to take a look at it and really vet it and vet your methods, it doesn't really stand as valid or as proven. Very similar with analysis. There's a lot of ways to torture numbers to make them say whatever you'd like them to say. So you really need to give every opportunity to have as many people take a look at it as possible and provide their insight on it so that you're not missing anything and that you're not following a rabbit hole on somebody who just really is convinced that hard seltzer is going to die next year. And that's just their hill they are going to die on. And there's nothing you can say to convince them otherwise. They're wrong. They might be right on everything else. But if you're not doing your due diligence of speaking to other sources of analysis and information, you're going to get yourself into trouble with them. When it comes to analysis, there's really 4 different types that you really need to be familiar with. And these are ones that you'll be able to do yourself, leading all the way into ones that might take a little more practice, but are a lot more useful. So the first is descriptive. Descriptive is kind of what a lot of people think of when they think of an analysis. That's just saying what happened. If I look at something that says that sales on Granny Smith apples are up year over year, then that's the descriptive analysis. Sales of Granny Smith apples are up year over year. That's a good thing to know, but that's all that it tells me. Diagnostic is the next step up. That's where you're saying not only are the sales of Granny Smith apples up year over year, but they're up year over year because people have started to transition some of their tastes to eating more apple pie. Well, if they're eating more apple pie, obviously they're going to need more Granny Smith apples. So now you not only understand what happened, but you also understand why it happened. Next is predictive. Predictive analysis is just saying that people are eating more Granny Smith apples. They're doing so because they're eating more apple pie. I predict that they are also going to start ordering more pie crusts. Now you're using the information that is at your fingertips in order to be able to really predict what is going to happen next. You're not just saying what is happening and why is happening, but where this will lead. And last but not least is prescriptive. Now, this takes everything that we've talked about before. It's talking about what happened. It's talking about the why it happened. It's talking about the what will happen next and saying, what should we do with this information? And that's the key. That's really the area you want your analysis to get to, even if it's something as small as trying to decide the next thing to go in your tanks, or it's as large as trying to create a distribution plan. You need to be able to take a look at what's happening in the data, take a look at what's happening in the market within your own business, and be able to not just say what is happening, not just say why it's happening, not just say what's going to happen next, but use that to make an action to be able to actually seize that moment and decide what you're going to do armed with that analysis and armed with that prediction. So when it comes to doing analysis yourself, a couple of things to keep in mind. And I promise we're going to get into some examples. This isn't just all going to be me talking out my ass at you. First thing to keep in mind, there is a pretty big difference between big data and small data. And this is a trap even a lot of professional analysts fall into. The things that are relevant to the industry as a whole are not necessarily going to be relevant to your business. The things that are relevant to Anheuser-Busch InBev or even Sierra Nevada are not necessarily the things that are going to be relevant to your business. Some of it will, but a lot of it won't. Sometimes that big data can also hide some very small trends that are very important. If you looked at the data surrounding beer as a whole in the 2000s, you would have come to the conclusion that it was an industry that was absolutely dominated by large brewing companies, and therefore it's not worth a whole lot of anyone's time or effort to try starting a new brewery. Now, we know that's wrong because we have 9,000 breweries and the craft beer industry commands roughly 20% of the entire beer industry. But if you're only looking at the big data, it's very easy for that to get lost in the aggregate. You need to be able to look just as small as you need to have a complete picture, but as big as you need to really get a sense of how it's interacting with the ecosystem at large. It's also important to keep in mind that just because something correlates does not mean that it is caused. What this means is really to keep in mind that just because you're seeing a connection between two different data points, that doesn't necessarily mean if you change one, it will in fact change the other. There's a lot of occasions where things might have a third aspect that's really dependent on both of those and triggers both of them to happen at the same time so that you can change those things independently and it doesn't necessarily mean one affects the other. I'll come up with a much better example, I'm sure, the moment I'm done with my presentation that will actually illustrate that. But just keep in mind that just because you're able to illustrate that as one thing rises or as one thing falls or as one thing changes, this other thing does as well, does not necessarily infer that one begets the other. It's also important to keep in mind, is there a trend? It's all well and good to say, for example, that beer grew 2% as an industry, but unless you understand what that means versus expectation, you're not going to be able to get a whole lot of real good insight out of that. We saw a lot of this when people were taking a look at the performance of the beer industry over the course of the pandemic, where a lot of people were pointing to certain numbers and certain data points and saying that beer was doing better or worse than it was actually doing, largely because they were not keeping in mind what the existing trend line had been. If every year beer had grown roughly 2%, then beer growing 2% is basically the same as beer having grown none at all, because that's what we would have expected without any sort of outside influence. So always keep in mind on where the trend line is headed, and that can also help you really get a good sense for where it's going to be. If you see IPAs growing, for example, at or actually hard seltzer, perfect example. There you go. Hard seltzer, as hard seltzer was growing, a lot of people kept looking for, is this next triple digit growth really where it's going to cap out? But as it was going, what you could really do is draw a trend line and see roughly the direction that it was headed. So that even when it was a relatively small piece of the industry, you could see that predictably it was going up above 100% growth year over year. Following that trend was what allowed some of those early companies to get in ahead of the crowd and get in ahead of when everybody was crowding into seltzer, to really be able to be the ones well established and there at the beginning, so that in our current era where seltzers have started to see a bit of a plateau effect, they're the ones who are not only the strongest, but likely the ones that are going to be the best positioned when that industry shakes out. And last but not least, it's always important to make sure that any piece of data that you are offering, any piece of data that you are deriving, keep in mind everything that's happening around it. Pandemic is another perfect example. If you look at that and you were just looking at the data on the chart with absolutely no context for why everything shifted in 2020, it'd be very easy to draw all of the wrong assessments, all of the wrong assumptions from that same data. You might just assume that everybody decided that they hated draft beer, or you might decide that, everyone suddenly turned antisocial and decided to stop being around each other. Well, they did stop being out in public. And yes, they started migrating towards packaged beer, but there's a massive piece of context around them. And that helps inform any of the predictions and any of the decisions that you make with that data. Always keep in mind the context. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up to completely miss the core reason for something that seems very obvious if you're just looking at a chart. So a few warnings and pitfalls in general with data. As we said before, what's happening in the industry is not necessarily what's happening to your business. Just keep in mind, really scale your data and really focus on the stuff that's useful to you. A lot of times that is going to be your own historicals if you're a smaller company, but also just keep in mind that you are still working within the overarching ecosystem of the industry. We make up the long tail. Anybody who's not familiar with that term, in general, with an industry that's relatively consolidated, you'll have a handful of companies at the top who have a ton of market share. And then the majority of firms will actually be little firms that form a long tail to the graph that make up, a relatively small market share, even altogether, and individually an absolutely tiny one. That long tail, by and large, is the area that we move in almost exclusively. So what's affecting the bulk of the industry isn't necessarily stuff that's going to be of use to us. Also, keep an eye out for the way that any sort of data is derived. This is especially important with any sort of market research. There's always going to be market research companies that either really have a pet process that they like to push, or they're really just trying to catch attention with a big, standout, attractive headline type of analysis. So always make sure you're able to dig in and get a good sense of where data is coming from, because even though it's rare for anyone to outright make up data, at least in anything that's published and is public, that doesn't necessarily mean that the means that they're using to actually get the data are going to hold any water. And that means that anything that you do using those assumptions isn't going to be fully informed. It's also very, very important to a couple of things related to the distribution of the data. So there's an old adage of the freezer and oven problem. So someone walks in a room and a thermodynamic scientist has their head in the oven and their feet in the freezer, and they say, how are you doing? They say, well, on average, I'm a perfect temperature. As you can see, there's a bit of a problem. Not sticking my head in the oven, not sticking my feet in the freezer. The issue is that the mean can sometimes be misleading with respect to what's actually happening with the data. And outliers can in particularly confound the entire analysis. So, for example, if all of a sudden Bill Gates decided to go ahead and log on and start watching this presentation, on average, the people watching my presentation right now would be millionaires, maybe even billionaires. That doesn't do a whole lot to pay any of our bills. And that doesn't mean that anybody outside of him really has much money to speak of. You own breweries. You're probably broke. I know I am. So keep an eye out for those outliers. And it's important to make sure that you're either weighting properly or you're disqualifying any of those ones that are very clearly outside of the mean, very clearly outside of what you can expect. And last but not least, just really make sure that when it comes to data, look at it with open eyes. All the time, if you're looking at objective data, you're going to run into those scenarios where it conflicts with something that you strongly believe, or conflicts with your assumptions, conflicts with what you had been building some of your assumptions on. And that's okay. And that's one of the chief things that we as a species have a hard time with. There is a scientist who made a famous quote. One of his friends asked him after one of his theories was refuted, said, well, how do you feel now that this theory that you had has been shown to no longer hold true? And he looked at him and he said, when the information changes, my analysis changes. What do you do, sir? And that question is very important, because for a lot of us, when we are challenged on the things that we assume and we're challenged on the things that we believe, what we instead do is double down on those. And that's not going to change the data, and that's not going to change what's actually happening. It can sometimes be a good sign that you need to dive in a little deeper to it and make sure that the data is not being misinterpreted or misconstrued or is inaccurate, but that doesn't make it any less factual. And it doesn't mean that what that data is telling you is going to wind up being any different if indeed it has been gathered right and you are interpreting it correctly. So approach the data with an open mind and be willing to reevaluate your own assumptions as it comes. So just a bit of a thought experiment, just to go ahead and run through what some of this would look like in practice. So let's say that you're running a brewery, a beverage company, you do a handful of different beers. And you're really trying to plan your production out. You know that all of your products, they're really kind of moving as fast as you're able to in the market. It's not that you're not producing enough, but you really need to be able to put your focus on one or two of those if there are any conflicts for resources, whether that's cash, capacity, what have you. So of your core lineup, you're really trying to decide what to lean in on. The IPA, blonde ale, you got American stout, a black rye smoked saison that one of your regulars, really, really wanted you to make. So he bought most of the ingredients for you, and he's like the only dude who drinks it. Or hard milk, because somebody decided that was a good idea, and apparently there's hard everything now. So what do? One of your staff says you should focus on the IPA. It's the one that generates the most revenue for you. That's the one that really sells the best in terms of raw numbers. Another one says, focus on that black rice smoked saison. He's buying all the ingredients. He's promised he'll buy you as many ingredients as you need, no matter how much you make. So it has a really, really good margin. And then somebody says, go ahead and do it with the hard milk, but that's a terrible idea. And I literally don't care what the numbers say. Don't make hard milk. That's absolutely disgusting. So what do? You go to the data. So you can go to the margin, and the margin will tell you some things. Margin will tell you what's going to make you the most back on the dollars that you spend. But just because it's most money back on each individual dollar that you invest in the product doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to sell enough of it to really make it back. I could make a product that was, at a 99% margin. I'm absolutely sure. But if I had to price it at that to get it to move, for example, if you have a hazy IPA, let's go ahead and start there. You have a hazy IPA that you want to go ahead and, make a 90% margin on. You could definitely sell that for like $50 a 4-pack. You'd sell none of them. So margin isn't everything. You got to keep into account the velocity at which you're able to move it. By that same token, though, just because something is selling the most does not necessarily mean that you are going to be able to make as much margin off of as you need to. If I'm only making 1% margin on something and I'm selling a absolute crap ton of it, then there's a solid chance I'm going to be looking at my P&L at the end of the year and wondering what the hell happened. I managed to sell myself into oblivion. You really have to be able to weight both against each other. So a really good metric that I've found, I've invented, that we use internally is daily gross profit. Now, I won't go too deep into the background of this, but really the idea here is if you take the daily rate of sale and you multiply it by the profit margin, what that's going to go ahead and do is give you a DGP value. That DGP value just gives you an idea that on any given day, it's going to provide you with that many incrementally more units than if you just didn't sell it at all. An example. So let's take those 5 different styles of product: IPA, blonde, stout, the black rice, smoked saison, and hard milk. Now, the column dollars per day, that's that rate of sale. That's how much dollar-wise you're able to sell each of these products in a given day. Now, keep in mind, these numbers are fairly arbitrary, and even the units, and I'll explain those in a bit, are relatively arbitrary. So yes, I know that selling $10 of something a day, especially if you're in distribution, is not a realistic number. It's too low. Meanwhile, selling $150 of something, if you have a tiny tap room with 4 tables, maybe that's good for you. That's not what's important. We're really looking at the rate of sale. So we're saying that the IPA sells about $150 a day. The blonde ale sells about $100. Stout sells about $60 a day. You only sell about $10 of the saison. You sell about $130 of the hard milk on a given day. And then to the right, we have their margins. IPA makes us a 25% profit margin. Blonde ale makes you a 40% profit margin, 35% profit margin for stout, 90% profit margin for the saison. Told you, he's buying all the ingredients. That's just corrugated and aluminum. That's, he's paying for almost everything. And then hard milk, making a 70% margin. It's just milk and alcohol. It's very simple. Did I mention it's disgusting? So looking at these on their face, it'd be very, very tempting to take a look at that IPA and say, hey, it's selling more than any of these other products. That should definitely be the one that we lean into and the one that we make the most of. On the flip side, someone could make a justification and say, taking a look at that margin, 90% margin is better by 20% than anything else that we're making. Why don't we lean in on that one? Well, assuming that just making more isn't going to necessarily sell you more, and in most cases that's the case, you can make as much of your core lineup, I'm sure, as you possibly could, and chances are good the follow-up would be, how do you move it? So assuming your velocity is relatively stable, how do you decide which of these products has the most value to your company? Well, that's where we get that DGP. What this means is that if you are selling $150 every day of that IPA at a 25% margin, that's 150 times 0.25. What that means is that you're going to be making roughly $37.50 of extra margin on a given day. That is money in addition to the cost of actually making the product. And that's what that 112.5 is. So that's the cost it takes you to sell that 150. It costs you $112.50 to sell $150 a day at a 25% margin, means $37.50 of that is going to be just straight gross profit. That's stuff you can take home. That's stuff you can redirect towards new products. That's stuff that you can pump into marketing or into increasing some of these beers that you do think you can increase the velocity on if you just had the more opportunity. That's what you take home. That's what businesses run on. That's a value. Now, looking at that versus looking at the Saison, you're only selling $10 a day. It might only cost you $1, and you're making a 90% margin. But at the end of the day, if you're only selling $10 worth, that's still only making you $9 of gross profit. So unless you think that pumping a ton more money into that Saison is going to let you sell that much more volume of it, if you think the market is that big for it and the only thing that's been holding you back is the volume you made, chances are good that you're going to look at that and say, man, at the end of the day, this is only going to get me $9. That's not nearly as much as $37.50. But the real big takeaway isn't the IPA and it isn't the Saison. Big takeaway is, well, let's throw the hard milk out. I'm not going down that path. I told you, we're never making more of it. But let's take a look at that blonde. $60 a day it costs you to sell $100 a product. So it's going to cost you a lot less than the IPA, and it's going to make you about a third less than the IPA in terms of revenue in a given day. But you're also making 15% more margin. That means over the course of any given day, you're going to make roughly $40 of just pure gross profit margin off of that blonde. That means that in a single given day, you're actually making more margin. You're making more profit. You're making more extra money over what you would otherwise have as a business, making that blonde ale, than you were off of either the IPA or especially off of that Saison. It's not the obvious answer, but it's the one that really reveals the value that it has to your business. Means that if you have to prioritize one of these, all other things being equal, the blonde is the one that gets you the best return outside of that abomination, the hard milk. Now, this does raise a couple of questions. This raises a couple of alternative approaches, things that you could be doing. One of the things that you could do is go ahead and lean all in on that Saison. Taking a look at this chart, that Saison only costs you $1 a day. So yeah, we're saying that the blonde is the one that's going to get you the best return. I understand that. Every day I'm making $40 of that for every $9 I'd make back at the current velocity on the Saison. But what if I just went ahead and spent the $59 that I'm saving on that initial investment in the Saison and instead spent on the blonde and instead made it on the Saison? I spent $60 making Saison instead of $1 making it. Now I'm making a $90 or 90% margin. Won't that make me so much more? Well, the problem is unless you're able to work that velocity up, unless you're able to work that rate of sale up, you're still only selling 10 units of that a day, which means that even if the initial investment is $59 cheaper than the blonde, you are still going to be significantly lower when it comes to the actual performance over time. So the chart on the left and the chart on the right is something different. We'll get to that in a second. The chart on the left goes to illustrate that even with that assumption, even if it costs you less to get the Saison on the ground, even if you took the money that you were saving and put it into more Saison at that higher margin, because you can't sell it as fast, not only will you not make up nearly as much money with this very bottom line here, which is that black rye smoked Saison, but you're still going to see a significantly lower return every day after day one. The initial investment's the only place you're saving, and unless you can pump that velocity and really get that thing selling at a real quick hum, there's no chance that that Saison is ever going to be a more viable option than anything else, as you can see there, including the stout that you carry. 90% margin or not, if the demand isn't there and you have no mechanisms to increase the demand for it that are, realistic and not going to cost you an arm and a leg, then it is not going to be worth your time putting any focus on it. Now, the second example is a little different. What happens if, for whatever reason, you only have the ability to produce so much of a given product at a time? You have one tank come up and you can produce 50 CEs worth of the product, and that's all you can produce no matter what you pick. So no matter how much demand there is, you are capacity constrained. Now, taking a look at that chart on the right, that means that at the most you can make 50 CEs a day of the IPA. At most, you can make 50 CEs a day of the blonde ale. At most, 50 CEs of the stout. At most, 50 CEs of that hard milk. And the demand is still only there for 10 CEs a day of the saison. Now, keep in mind, I switched dollars to CEs. Bear with me. When you're constrained on the actual amount that you can produce, that changes the equation a little bit. Now, the blonde ale is still your best competitor, even though you're only going to be able to make 50 units of it, because it has a 40% margin over the 35% margin of the stout. It's still going to outperform it, earn you back the enough to buy an incremental 20 extra cases a day over what you'd be able to do anyways. For the stout, it'll make you about 17 and a half to 18 additional cases you'll be able to produce every day just off the margin you're making off of those 50. But remember the IPA? The one that was doing as well as it was in the calculations only barely missed the blonde ale, mostly because it was doing $150 a day. It was selling 1/3 higher, 50% higher if you're working off of base 100, more than the blonde. Well, now all of a sudden it's dropped all the way to 12.5 because it was relying on volume to make up for the fact it had significantly lower margin. Now it's not that much better of an investment than the smoke saison. At that point, all of a sudden that margin becomes more and more important. And that's an important lesson as well when we start looking at the actual analysis. So what can we pull away from this? Well, one of the most important things to take away from it is that as you start approaching capacity constraints, margin becomes more important than velocity. And we saw that on that last chart. As we put an artificial cap on how much we could actually produce, an artificial cap on the demand for it, the rate of sale, all of a sudden that margin became way more important to that DGP and what it actually meant for the value of the brand. But it means that left to your druthers under the current assumptions, make more hard milk or blonde ale if you want to stick to beer. And just because something is cheaper to make also doesn't necessarily mean it's better for the bottom line. Just because you're able to keep your costs low, even if the margins are absolutely great, if you're not able to move it at a rate enough to offset the difference, then you're still going to wind up making far less money every day after day one. Volume is important. Just keep in mind, at the end of the day, you can't bank volume. It's great to sell a ton of beer. It's great to sell high volumes of beer. But as we saw from that, the margin is what made the difference between the blonde ale and the IPA, even without any capacity constraints. So keep in mind that margin is what allows you to reinvest in your business and allows you to grow it. And last but not least, just make sure that any sort of data that you're getting, you are comparing like to like. You're comparing something that's equivalent. It's all well and good to be able to compare the dollars that one thing's making and the euros that another thing's making and the rubles that another thing's making. But unless you know how to convert between those and have something that's useful for all of them, all you're going to do is lead yourself down the wrong path and some wrong assumptions. And these are just some good resources, some good sources if you're looking to find some additional information, additional data that's out there. Bureau of Labor Statistics has a whole lot of great information about the economy at large, but also about the consumer price index and employment statuses within the U.S. Obviously, Brewbound Data Club, very similar to Sightlines Plus, both fantastic sources. If you are looking into IRI or Nielsen data, I'd encourage you to also work with an outside analyst who has the time and the skill set to be able to parse it for you. Someone like Bump Williams, who is fantastic. And also some additional sites for news and insight. Rabobank is probably the one most people are not familiar with. They're one of the largest food and bev banks in the country, or in the world rather. They're based out of the Netherlands, do a lot of really, really good stuff. And have a fantastic podcast, Liquid Assets, if you ever get an opportunity to listen to it. Ton of great insight and can really help keep you informed with stuff that's actually important for all of us as an industry to be able to move forward. And that's me. Screenshot that because I'm about to exit it. Well, now I'm going to go ahead and open it up if there were any questions. I do want to just say thank you to Ethan and Christy for leaving your comments. And none of you can see the private chat, but Andrew said I did a good job. So I'm going to go ahead and take that and run with it. And yeah. If any of you have any sort of questions, anything that I can help with, any ways that we can assist in general, please reach out to me. My email is a.gore, Gore, at Bevana, Bevana.com. Always love meeting great people around the industry. Always love helping grow the knowledge within the industry, and always love to make a connection. Cheers, y'all.